All right, so Metagaiaes, an alternative global parallel society. That's what we're going to talk about today. So first things first, I would like to extend a warm thanks to John, Dana, and Mary of Modern Masters for hosting this meeting. I greatly appreciate you guys not only being interested in the Metatocracy and Metagaiaes and what we're doing here, but also in helping to host these meetings and spread this information to other people for everybody's benefit. So the itinerary basically is I'm going to go over who we are, Andrew and I, what the three problems of society currently are and their solutions, and how that pertains to everything we'll be discussing in this presentation, which is what is the metatocracy, where does it come from, how does it work, how can we use it to create a parallel global society, how would such a society work, and what actions do we need to take to co-create this society. And periodically along the way, I'm going to stop and see if anybody has any questions regarding the content that was just covered, rather than saving questions for the end. Because there's a lot of different kinds of information that's got to be covered here. And I want to make sure that everybody's understanding things as we go along. So don't be afraid to just, take your mic off and ask a question once I get to that point of asking if you guys have any questions. All right, so who are we? Andrew just introduced himself, so I'll introduce myself. I'm Kamiron Freeman, aka Seth Harris. Seth Harris is my real name. Kamiron Freeman is my pseudonym. There's a long story behind why I chose that as a pseudonym that I will avoid for time's sake right now, but I'll move on to say that I associate as what's known as a blueprinter originator. Andrew associates as a blueprinter designer, which are basically very much the same kind of a thing, whereas the originator comes up with the idea, the designer beautifies the idea. So we both associate as being like from the Andromedan galaxy and being dragons in past lives. Little interesting information about me is that I suffered a traumatic brain injury at 3 years old to my emotional cortex, which allowed a more complete version of my higher self to inhabit my body for about 25 years due to the lack of overwhelming emotion that I had. And that allowed me to gain a lot of interesting experiences that became memories that I could tap into after my brain healed, which thereby ended up causing me to suffer from amnesia before my emotions finally returned, allowing me to have just a sliver of egoic consciousness once again. But again, like I have access to all those memories from before to, how do I say, reap the benefits of the wisdom of that higher self who inhabited my body for so long, now that it's just me as a normal human being once again in this body. So a lot of the information that I'm going to cover in this presentation is a direct result of that interesting history that I have that allowed me to learn certain types of information and then eventually reconnect those dots in very certain specific ways. So moving on. All right, so the three primary problems of society that need to be resolved in order for peace, prosperity, and abundance for all to be, had once again in this world. These three primary problems can be summed up as indoctrination systems, which basically are like, religious institutions and public education. Basically what that does is it steals our sovereignty. The next problem is the pyramid power structure of authoritarianism, which steals our equality. And I'll explain why in a moment. The trade system of direct and immediate exchange, basically the, monetary-based trade system that we use, steals our freedom, and I'll explain what I mean about that. Oh, by the way, before I get any further, So we're going to have to cut this meeting off at 6:30 p.m. our time today. That's 4:30 p.m. your time, just to let you know. So we're however far we get through, we're just going to have to pick up where we left off when we come back for the next meeting. All right, so regarding the problem of indoctrination and its solution, right? So indoctrination systems were invented by the Sumerians about 6,000 years ago for the sole purpose of indoctrinating the masses from a young age into the idea that there is a hierarchy of gods who control nature, in order to indoctrinate them with the idea that hierarchy is natural. And the reason for this is quite simple, right? If you're not aware of a hierarchical mode of organizing information, then when you look out into nature, you're not going to see the hierarchy anywhere. The reason for that is obvious. It's because hierarchies don't actually exist anywhere in nature, right? So the only way to teach people that hierarchy is natural is to use a form of nature that you cannot see or observe, right? So AKA creating a religion of certain gods or of God and the angels or whatever the case may be, and then organizing that into a hierarchical structure, right? So if you get people to believe that nature is created by God or the gods, and then you get them to believe that the gods operate in a hierarchy, then you get them to believe that a hierarchy is natural and that everything should be organized according to a hierarchy, including the way that we rule our society, right? So that's the whole basis behind the indoctrination systems, or the first religions, which, you know, are today's education systems. Hierarchy is not natural. Nature is organized holographically. There is no above or below. There's only a within or a without, right? Now, in our two-dimensional lives, we can say up and down, right? But what we're really talking about when you're looking at a globe of an earth is there is no up and down. There's away from the earth, which is out, and there's towards the earth, which is in, right? There's no up and down. Nature's not organized hierarchically, it's organized holographically. So the solution to indoctrination it's pretty simple, actually. It's self-education and meditation, right? We can have types of public education systems, but those systems cannot be systems in which we, you know, are indoctrinating people with, you know, certain information and certain ways of seeing the world. Instead, they have to be systems that allow each individual to kind of guide themselves down their own path of education. You know what I mean? So that's the solution to indoctrination. It's allowing people to explore nature and explore knowledge on their own volition, right? Education, the word itself, comes from the Latin word educo, which translates as to educe, which means to draw out from within, right? So education itself can only be self-education, right? Whether that happens within a schooling environment or otherwise makes no difference. It has to be self-guided, right? By the very origin and meaning of the word itself. If it's not education, if it's not coming from the self, then it's indoctrination. All right, so now we have the solution to the trade-based systems, right? Trade, which is direct and immediate exchange, is a concept invented by mankind. It doesn't actually exist anywhere throughout nature, once again, right? So this is all, we've been indoctrinated to believe that if I do something for you or give something to you, that you're supposed to do something or give me something in return directly as a trade for that, right? We like to believe that this creates some type of order in society, if you will. But in reality, it actually creates chaos. When you look at nature, right? Nature doesn't operate based on direct and immediate exchange. Nothing in nature is actually directly exchanging anything with anything else in nature, right? The best example is the forest and the relationship between the plants, animals, and mushrooms. So for example, you have the animals, which are eating all the food from the trees, the plants, the fruits, right? Anything that plants are providing as food, the animals are eating, but the animals don't give anything to any of these plants in exchange for that, right? what they do is they leave behind their droppings, which the mushrooms and bacteria eat, right? That's food for them. They break that down, right? So they pass along the gift of their food to the mushrooms and bacteria, which creates food for them. And then those mushrooms and bacteria break that down and turn it into soil, which gives, food back to the plants, right? So you have this cyclical system of exchange that's indirect and transient in nature, not direct and immediate. And in that kind of a system of exchange, you end up creating an abundance of everything for everyone, right? Nobody has to worry about, what they're contributing versus what they're taking, because everything contributes so much of an abundance of everything that there's always more than enough, right? And whatever goes to waste gets recycled, right? And becomes food for something else, and the cycle still continues. This is just the way nature works. Our economy is supposed to mimic ecology, just like this, like as I'm explaining, but our economy doesn't, right? Because once again, we've been indoctrinated with the hierarchy, and we've been indoctrinated with this idea of direct and immediate exchange, for the sole reason that it breeds selfish behaviors, right? When, for example, when you're now working a job, right, in today's day and age, you're not necessarily, some people are working that job for the purpose of serving others, but most people that are working a job aren't working for the sake of serving others in the capacity of that job. They're working for the sake of making that paycheck, right? So they're literally working that job for a selfish reason, not for a selfless reason, right? And that's what direct and immediate exchange does, is it breeds these selfish behaviors to the point where we think it's actually normal to think in these forms of selfish behaviors, when in fact it's completely and totally unnatural. Now, on the other hand, indirect and transient exchange breeds selfless behaviors, right? When we have, for example, the free access economy that allows everybody to give of themselves freely and take from that which is given freely, we're no longer working for the sake of sustaining ourselves. We're working for the sake of serving others, right? Sustaining the community, sustaining the society itself, right? Bettering and improving and innovating the society so that it constantly becomes better, right? So that's the major difference between direct and immediate exchange and indirect and transient exchange. So the free access economy, therefore, which I won't be getting too much into detail in this presentation with, I'll briefly introduce it, but that's going to be another presentation for another time. But the free access economy is essentially the solution to trade, right? So holobank is basically how we will achieve this free access economy while allowing ourselves to do business with the rest of the world. So just as a brief introduction to that, holobank is what will become our central banking system, which will basically have changes in the way, the rules that it follows for money creation. And the fact that none of that money is owed back as a debt, that will enable all of our members of Metagaiaes, to create money on demand. So whenever they need to spend money, instead of having to move money from one account to another account by, quote unquote, paying somebody, they're literally just creating money on demand for that transaction, so they don't have to worry about how much money they have available, right? So that way we can start to introduce ourselves to what it's like to live in indirect and transient exchange while still using money, so that we can still do business with the rest of the world that's not making this transition to a free access economy. Moving on, we now have the solution to hierarchy, which is going to be the bulk of this presentation. So hierarchy is a system designed for one purpose only, right? To perpetuate slavery, okay? So it was designed based on the premise that not all people are equal, right? That some people are better than others, some people are superior to others, some people are smarter than others. Whatever the reasoning behind it might be, the hierarchy is designed to create masters and slaves, those who lead, those who follow, those who control, and those who acquiesce, right? Hierarchy is two-dimensional. It's up, down, left, right. Reality, however, is three-dimensional, which means it's holographic, it's in and out. There's no up or down, there's only in and out, there's only within and without, right? So the metatocracy is the solution to hierarchy, and that's mostly what we're going to talk about in the rest of this presentation here. All right, so core principles of Metagaiaes. Basically, all right, so while the goal is to ensure that Metagaiaes remains a society in which people of all different cultures, religions, and backgrounds will be free to express themselves in their own unique way, it's imperative moving forward in our evolution of consciousness / society that we maintain certain core principles, as these are the underpinning of what will allow us success where all other societies have failed. These core principles are few and are very simple. However, they are very difficult to accept for those who would consider themselves religious or non-spiritual, as well as for those who are self-serving. To allow anyone into our society that is not in full agreement with these core principles will only serve to eventually corrupt our society and bring about its failure. So these core principles are like an absolute, if you will, of all of the things in our social contracts. Everything is updatable and evolvable except these core principles, if you can allow me to put it that way. Right, so core principle number one is the law of one, right? Which literally means that there is only one being. Separation is an illusion of physical reality. Everything is energy, and all energy is one infinitely connected being, which you can call consciousness or God or creator or spirit or whatever else floats your boat. But basically, that's the law of one in a nutshell. There's only one of us, and our different minds and bodies are just different expressions of that same one thing, right? Everything we do affects everyone else, and everything everyone else does affects us, right? There's no escaping this reality. So number two is service to others, right? We recognize that when everyone serves the needs of others before themselves, we create an abundance of everything for everyone. But when everyone serves the self before others, like we have been for the last 6,000 years in all of our societies, we end up creating artificial scarcity. Number three is the metatocracy, right? Which is defined as holographically organized anarchism, right? What this means is that we recognize and respect the freedom, equality, and sovereignty of all others, which means we individually rule ourselves, and yet we participate as equals in the administration of our society. That means we all have to participate, right? There's no government that is separate from the people, right? That's the biggest mistake that every other society has made, has been separating the government from the people, right? It doesn't matter if you tell the people that they're the ones in control of the government, when all you allow them to do is vote for who gets elected, but you don't actually allow them to make the decisions, then the people aren't actually the ones in control, right? The people are supposed to be the ones actually making the decisions. The elected officials or representatives, whatever you want to call them, are only supposed to have the power to enact the decisions made by the people, right? We'll get into more detail about that as we go. Some principles of natural law, I'm covering this now because when it comes to the law, right? I mean, obviously, when it comes to society, you have to have what's called a social contract, right? But while there will be many layers to this society, as you'll see when we get there, and all of them will be able to create their own additional policies that are in alignment with their, religious or cultural beliefs. The core laws for, like the entire international society that is Metagaiaes need to be, number one, as simple as possible. And number two, cannot necessarily go too far beyond natural law, except as to say, be interpretations of natural law themselves for the core basic functioning of our society, right? So here are some basic principles of natural law. First of all, natural law has many sub-principles. A full discourse would require an entire book or several presentations, but we're just going to introduce what I basically call the 9 fundamental principles of natural law. Now, this isn't listed as one of the 9 principles, but one thing we need to understand moving forward is that ownership equals slavery, management equals stewardship, right? So trusts such as UFOs, which stands for Unified Fractal Organism, versus corporations and organizations, what that's referring to is when it comes to businesses and organizations, right, which is how our society is going to be based, right? Instead of basing our society on borders or boundaries or territories like every other society, ours is going to be based on quote unquote networks of people, right? And these networks are made through the organizations that provide products and services to the society, right? Because organizations that provide products and services to society are the actual functionings of society in and of itself. So ultimately, these organizations, rather than us having towns and cities, these organizations will be like our small community, and then networks of these organizations within a given network will become what we call metanations, and then bioregions, and then ultimately that all coalesces as the entire international global society, right? Now, trusts as unified fractal organisms, what a trust is it's a way of managing a business or organization without ownership, right? They've been around for thousands of years, and they've always operated under that premise, right? Because it's a fundamental basis of natural law that you can only own something if you are the creator of it. And while we are co-creators, we aren't like original creators. Like everything that's on the earth already exists, and all we can do is take it and turn it into different things, right? So we technically can't claim ownership over anything on the earth, but we can claim to manage certain things, properties, products, services, whatever the case may be. And trusts throughout the history of law have been used to manage such, properties and assets outside of the concept of ownership. Whereas then you have corporations and LLCs and other types of businesses, which essentially operate under the principle that, we own this, it's, everything's under our say, and, you do as we say or you don't work for us, you're fired, right? So it's a totally different perspective that we have to shift from, getting outside of thinking in terms of ownership and getting inside of thinking in terms of management and stewardship, right? Actually, on that note, I'm going to pause there and see if anybody has any questions. Do you know where my water bottle is? Thank you. I'm going to see if anybody has any questions regarding the concept of ownership there, because that's kind of a big one, and I know that can confuse a lot of people. Anybody? Bueller? Thank you.
Yeah, if you have a question, just go ahead and unmute your mic and go ahead and say it.
Is anybody confused about how ownership equals slavery and that we shouldn't be using the concept of ownership moving forward? All right, I'm going to assume silence is a no and move on. All right, so here are the 9. Say what?
You're preaching to the choir.
Awesome. Glad to hear it. All right. So here are the 9 basic principles of natural law, at least as far as our nexus of reality is concerned. So again, number 1 is the law of one, right? That's a universal law. That's the same everywhere throughout all of creation. The rest are the particular distortions of this law that we experience in our galaxy, right? So we have the principle of free will, which can also be called the principle of equality or sovereignty, or we could group all of that under the global term anarchism. Then we have the principle of responsibility, which could also be termed love or service, which basically all relate to what the book, The Law of One, refers to as the principle of creation or love. And then you have the principle of polarity or vibration or rhythm or gender or sex. Basically, these are what the law of one refers to as the principle of light. And then beyond that, we have the principle of trinity, which is unity. The trinity being the polarity of the singularity, all operating as one thing, hence trinity equals unity. Then you have the principle of attraction, otherwise popularly known as the law of attraction, which is also part and parcel of the process of creation. And this in the Kybalion philosophy is known as mentalism, right? Where the mind is everything and the mind is the sole source of control over, reality and manifestation. Then you have the principle of harmony, otherwise known as synergism, which basically is, as we use it, the mastermind principle, which we'll get into a little bit later on. Then there's the principle of karma, or reaping and sowing, which is basically the law of cause and effect as we know it. And then you have the principle of holographic organization, otherwise known in the Kybalion as the principle of correspondence. And for us, that's once again the metatocracy. Is that how much time we have left?
Mhm.
Okay.
Cameron, we did have a question in the chat room.
Yeah, go ahead. What is it?
It says, how is no ownership not Marxism?
Okay, because Marxism is state ownership. It's when the state owns everything and they decide who gets what, when, and why. Whereas no ownership means nobody actually has any full control over any of the resources, right? You can't have a free access economy and have some party in control of how those resources are distributed, right? It's either a free-for-all give and take, or it's somebody's in control, right? And so ownership equals slavery because it equals control, which is the role of the master in the master-slave relationship. Does that answer their question, or do they have a follow-up question?
I think that's good. We'll let him
Okay.
we'll go from there.
All right. So now we're going to get into the metatocracy a bit, and I got about 13 and a half minutes left. So hopefully we'll cover a good amount of this before we have to leave. So the metatocracy is the organizational system of nature itself, which is holographically organized sacred geometry, right? And you'll see what I mean by that in a minute. It can be seen throughout nature at every scale of existence. At some scales, it takes on a very beautiful simplicity, such as, moons orbiting planets, orbiting stars, orbiting galaxies. Also such as electrons orbiting a nucleus of an atom, or, the protons, quarks orbiting around within protons, superstrings orbiting around within quarks, things of that nature. And then other times it takes on intense complexity, such as these very same spiral nature shapes creating, trees and forests and, organisms and galaxy clusters and an entire universe, right? So it pans in and out of complexity from scale to scale. But ultimately, the metatocracy is based on the simplest version of these, as you can see throughout all of nature, which is what we see when we look around, outside into the universe, which is exactly what I said in the first place: moons orbiting moons orbiting planets, orbiting stars, orbiting galaxies, right? It's just this basic system of orbitals, right? So each of these celestial bodies orbiting around another contains an electromagnetic field, or AKA a sphere of influence. And so, for example, you have the sun, right, which has an electromagnetic field that surrounds the entire galaxy, and within the magnetic field, the planets orbit, right? So all the planets orbiting around the sun are contained within the field of the sun, right? So if you imagine the sun is like the nucleus of an atom, and you draw a circle, really big circle around that to represent its electromagnetic field, and now you have the circles inside that, right, within that field. Now you're getting a sense of where the idea of the metatocracy comes from. So let's just go ahead to that. All right. Okay, so first we're going to talk about how I discovered the design structure. So what you see on the left here is not the image I use currently, but this was an image that I created when I was trying to create a design for an electromagnetic generator that would require no fuel input or any input of any kind in order to start and run. Basically a generator that would run itself once assembled, right? So you don't even have to start it. It starts itself, it runs itself, it never shuts off. There's not even an on or off switch to this. Now I know it could be accomplished if only I could find the right design structure. But it was a bit of a trip trying to figure out exactly how that works. Like translating, I knew it would work in the same way as the orbitals of planets orbiting stars, orbiting the galaxy. But how could I do this with a series of, magnets in a small confined area, right? That was the question. So eventually I finally created this design based on this image that you're seeing here on the right, which is the fundamental of sacred geometry itself. So you have the flower of life symbol, going into its creation and expanding until you get to the fruit of life symbol at the end, which is that part on the bottom right of that image, which contains Metatron's cube, right? So when I saw that design, and go back here, and I took that and I replicated it into like a holographic version of that, which is now the image you see on the left. And after I created this design for the generator, I suddenly realized, oh, that's also the same design that I need to be running my businesses with in the future. And then upon realizing that, I was like, oh, if it could be used to run a business, it could be used to run an entire society. So that's how this journey really began. Now, I began studying sacred geometry, which is fundamentally based upon the flower of life pattern, as documented in every ancient civilization about, I want to say, probably 6 or 7 years ago now is when I was introduced to it. Sacred geometry was used in the construction of every ancient building, yet the information itself has always been occulted from the public because the information about sacred geometry contains everything one needs to know about how nature and reality operate, right? It's the underpinning of all natural law. If you understand sacred geometry, then you understand, at least the absolute basics of how everything in reality, everything in nature works. And you can take it and translate it into anything of the more complex nature. So as you can see, the flower of life ends up creating various symbols as you go about creating, expanding the image, which contain all the various perfect geometries of nature. The holographic version of this, again, is what I use to create this organizational system. So here you see the organizational system in use, right? So this is, for example, what a corporation today would look like in its first two layers of what would be the first two levels of their hierarchy. This would be how you depict it in the first two layers of the Metatocracy, right? So each diagram, or each circle in this diagram, is called a holosphere, which is short for holographic sphere of influence. The small circles represent individual people. More correctly, the color of each one of these circles represents a particular type of role that they play, which we'll get into when we talk about the mastermind, probably in the next meeting. The larger circles surrounding each of these orbitals represents the sphere of influence of the one who is at the center of that sphere, which is known as the heart chakra, right? So each group of these orbitals could be called a holosphere or a mastermind, right? Depending on what context you're talking about. So just real quick to explain what you're seeing in this image. So for example, you have the CEO in the center of this, right? So this circle on the outside of that circle is like his immediate holosphere. So these people directly orbit around the CEO, right? And each one of them have their own holosphere that people orbit around them within, right? So you could think of these as like solar systems to the galaxy, right? And this big outer circle here, right, is also green because it is the greater holosphere of the CEO here, right? So, you know, like he's the heart chakra, if you will, of this entire organization, right? And then you have, for example, this holosphere here is colored purple, just the same as, you know, this person is colored purple because that's the role that he plays. But this circle is now colored green because that's the color of the heart chakra, right? So hence the reasoning for those colors. So what am I forgetting to explain here? Oh, it'll come to me. Let's move on for now. I just went backwards, didn't I? Let's move forward, please.
Cameron,
Say what?
I do have a question. So because the whole of this thing is green, but we're outside of ownership, like does the CEO get to influence everyone, or is his influence curtailed?
Yeah, and influence is the correct word here, right? Rather than control, right? So in the old paradigm of the hierarchical model, the CEO in this case would be in control of everything. In this case, he has the most influence over the entire organization, you could say, right? So, and going back to the concept of ownership on this case, right? So what we're used to in the old paradigm of thinking is we create a business and we expect to basically own and run that business for life, right? It's like our love child, you know, and we want to have 100% control over everything about how it develops as we go along, right? But that's going to be probably the most difficult concept for us to overcome moving forwards, because, and we'll get into this later in more detail, but okay, yeah, in a minute, interject when I'm done. So for example, let's take this business here as an example. So let's just say this CEO in this diagram is the one who originally started this business, right? And let's say this is the size of the business there, and it doesn't get any larger than this. So that's all of the people within it. So that means only the CEO in this case is going to be one of the people that's participating on the council as a representative of their organization on the council for Metagaiaes, right? So, and that's a whole other thing to explain. But essentially, all right, so instead of us having an administration system, right, a government that's separate from the people, this is how we create an administration system that's by the people itself, right? So the leaders of our companies are also the leaders that are in our councils, right? So when you create a business, you're basically automatically joining one of the councils for having created that business. But in order to have a limitation of term, right? Having positions on the council, which in my mind, so far up to this point, seemed to be an absolute necessity. That literally means that eventually somebody has to replace that CEO. Somebody has to be elected into that position to replace the CEO, not only in their position within that company, but also their position as representative on the council, right? And we're never really going to be able to allow ourselves to relinquish that, you know, power and control, as long as we still think in terms of ownership rather than management, right? Like we created this business not necessarily to profit ourselves, but to provide a product or service for the betterment of society, right? And in so doing, you know, that organization in and of itself needs to have the freedom to evolve on its own from the will of the people that are within that organization as well. So it needs to have, just as much as our, you know, administrative system needs to have a rotation of people in those positions of responsibility as opposed to positions of power. The same would be true of the person at the heart of management of that organization, if that makes sense. Did I answer your question, or?
Yeah, that was good. And also the point that, like, in this case, I think you laid out really beautifully in your course, the CEO doesn't get to go over to the CMM sphere and like lean on the graphic artist. He gets only to communicate like through his own sphere of influence, which I thought was
Right. And so there's actually a process to that, right? Since you can't give commands or orders in the metatocracy because everybody is equal, if the CEO has a vision for something that, you know, he wants to accomplish, and that requires, you know, somebody to take on a certain extra responsibility that they don't normally take on, what he has to then do is draw up an action request or a project request form, and then send that to the appropriate sphere of influence or holosphere that can do that work, and have somebody, everybody will have the opportunity to decide who's going to sign off on taking responsibility for it. And that's how that person ends up taking accountability for, you know, taking on that responsibility, to track the results and all that back to who does the work. All right, so this is a really powerful thing that I want to cover a little bit before we have to go. How much time do we have left? Like 5 minutes? Oh, it's already time. All right. Well, I'm going to cover this real quick, and then we'll do questions real quick before we end this meeting. So, masterminding your business. Basically, the metatocracy creates what I call a holographic mastermind, right? So, a lot of people tend to think of a mastermind as an individual. Like you had that TV show Mastermind, that was like this really smart person that controls everything and blah, blah, blah. But that's not what a mastermind actually is. What a mastermind really is a group of people operating in a state of harmony towards the achievement of the same goals, right? So at the top of every pyramid of every corporation is the board of directors. This board of directors is a mastermind, right? So that's a classic example of a mastermind. Now, if masterminds are exponentially more effective than a single individual, then a business that is holographically organized with masterminds would be exponentially more effective than a business with only a single mastermind, right? Now, here's how the math works. It works by the law of squares. Let's assume that on average, each individual person equals 1 unit of intelligence, right? So with the law of squares, 1 person can contribute 1 unit of intelligence. Therefore, 2 people can contribute 2 units of intelligence. But from 3 people forward, you generate what's called synergy, right? So 3 people doesn't just equal 3 units of intelligence, it equals 2 squared units or 4 units of intelligence, right? So 4 people then equals 2 cubed or 8 units, 5 people equals 2 to the 4th power or 16 units, right? So on and so forth until you get to 7 people or 7 roles, right? Which equals 64 units of intelligence from only 7 people, right? So if a corporation has a board of directors that consists of only 7 people, then the mastermind at the top of their organization has a total collective intelligence of 64 units, right? But now if you take that same, board of directors idea and fractalize that throughout the entire organization so that every group now has its own mastermind, right? And let's say this business only consists of 7 different groups, 7 different masterminds, and that's it, right? Each containing 7 people. Well, now each one of these groups represents 64 total units of intelligence, right? Not 1 unit of intelligence, but now 64 units. So that means 2 groups equals 128 units of intelligence. So when you get to 3 groups, you're now creating synergy again on a larger scale, which is now 128 squared or 16,384 units of intelligence. By the time you get to just 7 groups of people operating as a holographic mastermind, that's 128 to the 6th power, which is 4,398,046,511,104 units of intelligence, all coming from only 49 people, right? That's a huge, huge difference in organizational power, in the power of the collective intelligence versus individual intelligence, right? So that's one of the biggest benefits of using the metatocracy. What this basically means is that even if we're only operating at half efficiency, which we're bound to at first because we're still figuring this out and figuring out how everything works and figuring out how to work together with each other in this capacity, even when we're only operating at half capacity, half efficiency, we are still generating well over 2 trillion units of intelligence and creativity from a group of 49 people, of 7 different groups of a mastermind, right? All working together on a single thing. That's a huge difference to the mere 64 that your average corporation is getting, right? So just imagine what we would be capable of accomplishing with that math in mind, right? In the metatocracy, every individual manages themselves, and together they collectively manage their masterminds. Furthermore, every mastermind or group of orbitals manages itself as its own administration, and together they all administrate the business or organization. Finally, all the businesses using this very system administrate their local communities and the greater whole of society. And unfortunately, that's where we're going to have to cut this meeting off, and we'll get into how we expand into a society from there in the next meeting. So with that, are there any final questions before we end this meeting?
Also thoughts, reflections, feedback, all of this.
I have a question. This is Dawn.
Yeah.
What industry are you thinking of applying this to first? Or are you thinking of spirituality first and then going forward?
Well, it's a blanket approach, really. So we're covering all industries that a society needs. It's more of a question of who's going to be the first amongst us to join, and how can we attract the core key groups that we need to join immediately in order to create a very comfortable society as quickly as we possibly can. Like, for example, some of the key, well, the first key things we need done is the creation of a social administrative social media system using HoloMap and HoloWeb technology and HoloChain technology. And we need our central banking system for our free access economy. But aside from that, core things that we need are like airport companies to join us, airliner companies, so we have the ability to travel without having to deal with their, regulations, travel regulations, and things of that nature, so that we can freely travel around the world without having to go through COVID policy bullcrap type things. We need to acquire ports and shipping companies for the transportation and trade of goods across the world. Healthcare would be one of the most important that we need to get, so people can get proper healthcare again. Go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So go ahead.
I think that I can see where you're going with this. I actually did something like this. I have this model that I did 20 years ago, very similar to this, and I applied it to a circular economy. That's what I call a hologram. I guess we're not meant to talk. Do you have an email? I could just email these to you, because I think I have more questions for you. But it's the next time. I know you're limited time.
Yeah, Cameron, do you want to mute for a moment and we'll kind of wrap things up and get contact information? Yeah, thanks. I know Cameron's got some stuff going on in his location there. So yes, Dawn, we will send out Cameron's contact information, his website. We'll also share, Cameron has built a really powerful and beautiful course on our website, which we can share with you guys as well, so that you can go through and learn more. There's his Proton Mail email right there.
Awesome. Cameron, do you want to pop in your website as well? And the course, just to follow up, I'm sorry to interrupt you, John, is also really great for kind of taking his information at your own pace. And it's really great if you're a better if you like reading to retain information. So like for me, that course and kind of working through it at my own pace was like, oh yeah, no, this is great. And so I highly recommend it along with his other work.
Yeah. And we can stay on for a few more minutes. I know Cameron is having some stuff going on there. So if other people want to chat, you want to ask about more about his work, Dana and I know quite a bit about it. And then also if you have any questions about Modern Masters or how to get involved there, we can share that with you too.
Yeah, or you can keep throwing out questions for Cameron, and maybe it's quiet over there. The horde of the Metatocracy that's rushing to join him has left the room, maybe.
Is there any way before we leave that we can decide on the schedule, date and time for the next meeting?
Cameron,
That way everybody here is already aware.
let's do it after, and I'll send out an email.
Okay. All right.
Well, I want to thank Cameron really quite a bit, not only for doing this, but also for being really a active part of our community. And he's really been a great not asset, but collaborator with us. So thank you, Cameron. And we will set up the next meeting and send out emails to everybody. And again, if you guys want to stay on for a few more minutes, we can talk about what we know about Cameron's information or anything about Modern Masters too. And thank you, Andrew, as well.